We're living through an era in which neurobiologists now routinely investigate associations between molecular level biochemical pathways, emotions, and complex social behaviors. Some of the empirical findings raise important questions about how the detailed physical chemical explanations starting to emerge relate to our ordinary understanding of persons, or to aspects of ourselves traditionally regarded as core features of personality and character. Could there come a time, as Owen Flanagan put it to me, when instead of saying things like, "That's just what I expected of Karen. She's so generous and trusting," or "I admire Kent. He's such a faithful husband and devoted father," we would comment on her high oxytocin levels, or say, "What a magnificent distribution of vasopressin receptors in his ventral forebrain." Consider two recent claims about the profound implications of studies on vasopressin and oxytocin, two structurally similar hormones involved in chemical signaling in the brain, for ethics. First, there's Patricia Churchland's claim, based on the role that oxytocin and vasopressin play in the long-term pair bonding of prairie voles, that social attachment is the neural platform of morality. My aim here is to tell the story of the impact of neuroscience on our understanding of morality. It begins with the now legendary research on the neurobiology of mate attachment in voles. Philosophically, these results were alarming. Monogamy seemed to be a complex life choice, requiring rational adherence to a universal rule and conscious self-control. It was commonly argued that one had a moral duty to be monogamous, and that this duty is owed to moral deliberation and reason, or perhaps to God's commands. The very possibility that pair bonding in humans might be significantly underpinned, or even modestly affected, by the density of receptors in simple peptides, oxytocin and arginine vasopressin, in brain-specific regions, seem difficult to square with the high-minded requirements of moral duty. Second, there is Paul Zach's claim about the new science of what makes us good or evil in the moral molecule, the source of love and prosperity. He says, "My research had demonstrated that this chemical messenger, oxytocin, both in the brain and in the blood, is in fact the key to moral behavior. Am I actually saying that a single molecule, and by the way, a chemical substance that scientists like me can manipulate in the lab, accounts for why some people give freely of themselves and others are cold-hearted bastards, why some people cheat and steal and others you can trust with your life, why some husbands are more faithful than others, and by the way, why women tend to be more generous and nicer than men? In a word, yes." Now, these are interpretive claims about the philosophical significance of a particular body of scientific research. And today, what I want to do is identify some issues in which neurobiological accounts of the distal and proximate causes of social behavior could, in principle, be relevant to virtue theory. But I want to resist buying into some of the hype that has surrounded the research. I will argue that so far, the results of these studies are open to interpretations that are not nearly as revisionary for our common sense understanding of persons or rational action as some would have us believe. Along the way, since he's done so much work for us in these last few years, I will point out some ways that Christian Miller's framework stands up quite well when applied to an area of research that he's not yet considered. Now, look, these are complex issues, and I am neither a neuroscientist nor an ethicist, so I don't pretend to have the final word on any of this. Voles are attracting a lot of attention these days because genetic variation at a single locus appears to have a profound impact on a complex social behavior, namely monogamy. Different species of these mouse-like rodents exhibit interesting differences in social structure. Unlike montane and meadow voles, which lead a relatively solitary lifestyle and are promiscuous or indiscriminate in their mating, prairie voles are among only about 3 to 5% of mammals classified as socially monogamous. Researchers are investigating the evolution of social behavior and the neural mechanisms underlying pair bond formation. In prairie voles, the arginine vasopressin 1A receptor gene has a microsatellite region with repetitive sequences that modulate gene expression in a cell-type dependent manner. The longer pattern leads to increased expression of vasopressin receptors in the brains of the monogamous prairie voles, and it's almost entirely absent in the promiscuous montane and meadow voles. Researchers can, by viral vector transfer, insert copies of the prairie vole V1AR gene into target cells in the montane and meadow vole brains. And what they find, strikingly, is that when they manipulate the promoter sequence of a single gene, the male montane and meadow voles start acting more like prairie voles, exhibiting more pair bonding, frequent side-by-side contact or huddling, and biparental care. And the proposed explanation seems plausible. When the vasopressin receptors, which are involved in the neural circuitry for social recognition, get activated concurrently with the dopamine receptors in the ventral forebrain, this association leads to a conditioned partner preference. Neuroscientists are starting to understand enough about the links between the genome, neuroanatomical phenotype, the functional role of the neuropeptides, and their connection to the dopamine reward system to manipulate the system in a number of ways. Oxytocin, vasopressin, and dopamine are released during sexual activity in both species. But the distribution of receptors is important. So simply injecting vasopressin into the central nervous system of unmodified montane and meadow voles does not increase affiliative behaviors. Prairie voles have a much higher density of vasopressin receptors in the ventral pallidum and of oxytocin receptors in the nucleus accumbens than montane and meadow voles, regions of the brain associated with dopamine reward and reinforcement. So blocking the vasopressin receptors in males prevents pair bonding. Similarly, in female prairie voles, if you interfere with signaling by blocking either the oxytocin receptors or dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens, pair bonding is inhibited. That is, no partner preference develops after mating. In Larry Young's vole lab, they can turn monogamy off and they can turn it on. Now, there are, of course, serious questions about how similar manipulations might translate into other mammals, including humans. But there's a growing literature using a broad array of new techniques to study vasopressin and oxytocin directly in humans. So perhaps even more intriguing than behavioral differences across species is the question of whether differences in behavior among individuals in the same species correlate with genomic or neuroanatomical variation. So in a 2008 study, Hasse-Wallem found that in men, genetic variation in the vasopressin receptor gene, so we've got this V1AR gene, associates with the reported quality of their relationships. Paul Zach's group at Claremont investigates the relations between oxytocin level and behavior in humans. So for example, after putting about 2 teaspoons of oxytocin up subjects' noses, unacquainted people exhibit more generous and trusting behavior in the investment games Zach has designed. Zach reports that participants with elevated oxytocin are up to 80% more generous in dictator games and transfer an average of 17% more funds in trust games. Other studies also indicate that increasing oxytocin increases trust, empathy, eye contact, face memory, and generosity. So this research teaches us both about distal and proximate causes of social behavior. So before I discuss the implications of Paul Zach's work on oxytocin in humans, I want to make several remarks about what I take Churchland to show. So in Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality, Patricia Churchland says that the investigation of the role of oxytocin and vasopressin in the long-term pair bonding of prairie voles convinced her that social attachment is the neural platform for morality. Now, I do think that there's an interesting and plausible story to be told here about the evolution of basic dispositions to extend care. So, the arginine, vasopressin, and oxytocin peptides are found in all mammals, and each of these molecules is composed of 9 amino acids. They differ only in 2 amino acids from each other, and structurally similar molecules can be traced back about 700 million years across diverse vertebrate taxa, so things like birds, reptiles, and fish, and invertebrate taxa, including leeches, snails, some insects, and hydra. So they're ancient and highly conserved. Now, in mammals, the stress-relieving oxytocin is released in response to sexual stimulation when the uterus dilates to give birth and during nursing. Oxytocin is also involved in maternal nurturing. Mammalian young, they're vulnerable creatures, and their survival is highly dependent upon the quality of maternal care. Unless the sphere of care is extended beyond self-care, they would perish. So, the hypothesis is that the system involved in bonding between mother and pups got tweaked so that care and attention was extended to the male partner. The same molecules, circuitry, and brain regions are involved in both maternal and pair bonding. And we can imagine similar heritable influences on pair bonding being selected in males in environments where biparental care or aggressive territorial mate guarding increases fitness. So, Churchland is suggesting that selective affiliations, such as the mother-infant bond, might gradually have expanded to partners, to kin, and to wider communities, giving rise to increasingly complex cooperative social behaviors like hunting and wolf packs that are motivated and modulated by neurochemical rewards. So I think that this evolutionary scenario is the hypothesis that morality originates in the neurobiology of attachment and bonding is worth taking seriously, and it seems to fit reasonably well with the facts. So far, then, what we have is a descriptive evolutionary account of mammalian social attachments, sensibilities, and motivational responses, which come to play an important role in social behavior. And some ideas about how this might fit into a more complex and still incomplete genealogical story about the origin and development of moral judgment and behavior. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, so what? I'm still waiting to hear what substantive implications this could have for moral philosophy. Doesn't the fact-value distinction make empirical work like this largely irrelevant to ethics? Science can tell us about humans as we are, but it does not entail a particular conception of who we should aspire to become. Now, that much I think is true. We face moral and evaluative decisions that cannot simply be read off of science. Facts about the evolution of social attachment cannot by themselves justify the claim that some particular end is good or desirable. But I think it would be a mistake to leave matters there, because there are many ways in which the kind of empirical information coming from neuroscience can still be relevant to ethics. So, as Hume taught us, you cannot derive an ought from an is, but there are facts about what you and I value. Some of these concern matters that we care deeply about and endorse upon reflection. We do develop deep social attachments, and many of our concerns go well beyond self-interest. Moreover, what we care about is often rather deeply entrenched in, and to some extent constrained by, our biological and psychological makeup as individuals and as a species. So if our species does have widespread dispositions to benevolence or violence, or if social rejection causes us anxiety and distress, or if we're susceptible to in-group biases. Clearly, the evolutionary story can help us to understand them, and the identification of such traits should be of interest to projects aimed at shaping character. Caring about something, at least if it involves identifying with or endorsing the desire upon reflection, can provide us with reasons for and not just causes of action. Moreover, given that I care about something, there are often objectively better or worse or more or less effective ways of trying to achieve that goal. So if I have a deep and abiding desire for my children to flourish, there are some obvious ways in which considerations of fairly objective facts related to health will factor into any plausible account of what flourishing might consist in. So, although facts about the evolution of social attachment can't tell us what to value, they can tell us about what we do value, and from there, a lot about how best to achieve those ends. So, these studies of the effects of oxytocin and vasopressin also raise questions about the proximate causes of complex social behaviors. We saw an example of the striking way in which manipulating a single gene influences social behavior in voles. And there's now a large and varied scientific literature that establishes some important causal linkages between oxytocin levels and various behaviors used to measure trust and generosity in humans. So listen to how Zach understands the significance of his work in this Wall Street Journal interview.
I'm Gary Rosen, the editor of Wall Street Journal Weekend Review, and we're here today with Paul Zak, the author of a new book called The Moral Molecule. Let's just start with the title of this book. It's called The Moral Molecule. So what is this molecule, and in what way is it moral?
So this book is about my unlikely discovery of a brain chemical called oxytocin that motivates people to engage in moral behaviors. So it sheds new light on the longest debate since humans have been having debates, which is, are we good or evil? And we've shown that when you turn on oxytocin in the brain, people engage in virtuous or moral behaviors. But we can develop stimuli in the laboratory that cause the brain to release this chemical, and we developed a nasal inhaler in which we can shoot it into the human brain safely. And in both cases, when oxytocin is raised, people are more generous, they're more compassionate, and in particular, they're empathic. That is, they connect better to people emotionally, and we tend to treat others that we're connected to emotionally well.
But you've also induced oxytocin into your study subjects. So you have tried to manipulate them directly. And what were the results there with these oxytocin nasal sprays?
Right, so using the oxytocin nasal spray, we can actually turn on moral behaviors like a garden hose. We can make people more trusting, more compassionate, more generous, more empathic. So we know there's a direct relationship between oxytocin in your brain and these particular moral behaviors.
All right, so both Patricia Churchland and Molly Crockett have criticized the characterization of oxytocin as the moral molecule with definite article and capital M's. I mean, oxytocin serves in a wide range of causal roles, and even in a strictly neurophysiological account of empathy, it's far from being the only molecule involved. However, the necessary caveats do not change the fact that feelings of empathy can vary with and at least be partially mediated by oxytocin. All right, so what significance could this have for virtue theory? Now, there are a lot of different ways that virtue theories have been and can be developed. So of any particular theory, we should ask, what sort of empirical content does it have? What observations could, in principle, undermine or vindicate its key concepts or assumptions? I think here we can distinguish between two quite different goals or expectations that one might have for virtue theory. Consider first what we might call a purely aspirational project in virtue theory. It holds up exemplars for our imitation, perhaps drawn from real life or fiction, and invites us to share a rich range of value judgments about what traits of character or acts we should admire and cultivate or eschew. Inspiring portraits of moral excellence or of weakness and deficiency on display in heroes, villains, and ordinary folk might motivate us to shape our lives, how we treat each other, regulate our emotional responses, and our practical reason in quite particular ways, or teach us to identify the morally salient features of a situation. Such projects might base an account of good or right action in a picture of the fully virtuous person. Certainly they could prompt us to reflect on what's really worthwhile, or whether we have an adequate understanding of what flourishing consists in. Any stake that such a normative theory might have in claims about human nature might be so unspecific, non-committal, or peripheral that it wouldn't much matter what's going on in our brains. But most virtue theories don't limit themselves in this way so strictly, and instead seek to connect more deeply with the details of an adequate moral psychology. So, virtue ethicists have often developed their theories in ways that have a significant stake in substantive claims from moral psychology, sometimes making fairly specific assumptions about human nature. So as an example of one way in which contemporary virtue theories go beyond the purely aspirational project, consider the explanatory project. A lot of virtue theorists are invested in the task of developing a moral theory that will also serve to explain and predict behavior by appeal to character traits. So here's what Alasdair MacIntyre takes his own project to be committed to in After Virtue. It says, "My account is Aristotelian in that it links evaluation and explanation in a characteristically Aristotelian way. From an Aristotelian standpoint, to identify certain actions as manifesting or failing to manifest a virtue or virtues is never only to evaluate. It is also to take the first step towards explaining why those actions rather than some others were performed." MacIntyre is confident that there's no replacing explanations of this kind. Indeed, without allusion to the place that justice and injustice, courage and cowardice play in human life, very little will be genuinely explicable, and goes so far as to say that explanatory projects in the modern social sciences which omit reference to them are, for that reason, bound to fail. Explanation and prediction are among the functional roles that Christian Miller envisions for character traits. So, character traits are called upon to play a causal role in explaining and predicting behavior. These are ambitious goals. And let me point to 3 issues to which neuroscience could, in principle, be relevant. So, first, what we learn in neuroscience might change or supplement our understanding of what grounds character trait properties ontologically. So, for example, Miller cashes out trait dispositions in the concepts of folk psychology. Second, if one takes causally explaining and predicting behavior to be part of the task of a moral theory, then there's a question about whether these might come into competition with neuroscientific theories covering the same phenomenal domain. Third, as we elucidate causal mechanisms for behavior at the neural level, this might lead us to reclassify the moral status of a lot of actions, or even to rethink assumptions that we've made about persons and agents. So, suppose that we've always explained why Karen is so generous and trusting by appeal to certain character traits, perhaps the traditional virtue of generosity, or on Miller's view, by a mixed trait constituted by, perhaps identical with, dispositional beliefs and desires. Now the neuroscientist proposes a different explanation in terms of chemical factors of which previously neither Karen nor we were consciously aware. Increasing oxytocin levels has a significant causal influence on her generous behavior. So there's a question about how these explanations relate. And the answer to it might affect our thinking on all 3 of the above issues. Now, it might be that ascriptions of the attitude types of folk psychology will map cleanly onto underlying brain states identified by neuroscience. But it also seems possible that things won't go so smoothly. and that neuroscience will come to offer alternative explanations that replace those offered by the virtue ethicists of our day, or attempt to recover the phenomena that we're talking about in disorientingly unfamiliar terms. So obviously, if eliminativism were true, and there are no beliefs and desires, that'd be a problem for these kinds of explanatory projects, right? So the point here is just, I'm trying to show the in-principle relevance of neuroscience. But here, Miller can make a strong and quite sensible case for folk psychology, pointing not just to its success at the everyday level, but also to empirical support for psychological theories like the CAPS model, or to entire areas of psychology that take appeals to items like beliefs, desires, plans, and intentions to be not only legitimate and empirically well-grounded, but as indispensable to understanding human behavior. Some explanations of this style assume a high degree of introspective access, not just to our own mental states, but that other people's motivations, intentions, beliefs, and desires are transparent enough for us to reliably discern them and use them to make predictions. But Miller draws on work by psychologists Sabini and Silver to take on board the idea that mental states like fear of embarrassment can explain a lot of results in social psychology, even if subjects are not conscious of its playing a causal role in their own practical deliberation, or any role in their own practical deliberation. Now, this seems like a defensible way to go. I mean, it would be nice eventually to have some sort of account of how mental states relate to the neurophysiological states, or perhaps some kind of multi-level perspective on explanation, which helps us to understand clearly how both kinds of factors, feelings of empathy and oxytocin levels, can legitimately enter into causal explanations of behavior. But it's reasonable to expect that dispositional beliefs and desires have some sort of neurobiological grounding, and one that isn't merely epiphenomenal. We can also draw on Miller's mixed trait framework for thinking about oxytocin and vasopressin cases. All right, so the virtuous person tends not only to behave well or appropriately, but does so for the right reasons and with good or appropriate motivations. So we might treat cases in which the external administration of oxytocin via nasal inhaler increases generous behavior as situational factors, similar to cases in which fragrances in the shopping mall increase helping behavior. So in Barron's study of the influence of the smell of freshly baked cookies on helping behavior, if what's activated is a desire to maintain a positive mood, that's not a morally admirable reason for helping. Similarly, Zach's nasal spray studies suggest that explanatory appeals to traditional virtues are leaving out an important factor, the causal influence of oxytocin levels on generous behavior. Moreover, whatever trait is involved, it's responsive to factors that are not morally relevant reasons for trusting or acting generously. The mixed trait framework, in contrast, can incorporate them, provided that we identify some mental state dispositions triggered by the increase in oxytocin, and that these psychological states play a genuine explanatory role in the causal explanation. So Miller can view the increased oxytocin levels as enhancers of generous behavior associated with, but not constitutive of, a mixed trait with some more uncertain moral status. That is, if Karen's oxytocin levels were not so high, then we would expect her generosity to decrease significantly. And there'd be ways of further specifying the content of the mental states involved experimentally. For example, the hypothesis that the mental state triggered by oxytocin is a feeling of empathy, which maybe involves social cognition, perceiving a situation from another's perspective, beliefs about the needs of others, and an emotional response to those needs, such as a desire to help, would make different predictions about behavior to be expected in other trait-relevant situations from one that said what we're increasing in the investment games is risk-taking behavior, say. So Miller's view can parse such cases nicely. But when discussion shifts to natural variation in our oxytocin levels or genetic differences that influence behavior, it's not always so clear, to me at least, what to say. There are still deeper questions about how these relate to virtue-theoretic concepts like persons, agents, or selves lurking here. Patricia Churchland suggests that the work on voles has revisionary implications for the traditional understanding of free will. She says male prairie voles with lots of vasopressin binding sites are monogamous, while montane voles with few are promiscuous. What determines the density of binding sites? Genes. Granting the effects of cultural complexity, something similar probably holds for humans too. As neuroscience uncovers these and other mechanisms regulating choices and social behavior, we cannot help but wonder whether anyone truly chooses anything. I suggest that free will, as traditionally understood, needs modification. So, I don't see these kinds of implications in the Voles studies, and I think here the shift from voles to humans is important. Indeed, we can draw on a point that Aristotle makes in the Eudemian Ethics about our capacity for independent rational reflection to give a plausible interpretation of what's going on in the Voles studies. So, what scientists seem to be manipulating are motivational states. The voles seem to follow their strongest desires, and so by influencing the motivational state, their behavioral outcomes can be controlled fairly tightly. But the situation is likely to be more complicated in humans because we, at least, are able to step back from our inclinations and make autonomous judgments about whether they provide good or moral reasons for action. Indeed, it is precisely this self-governance in reasons-responsive practical deliberation with which ethicists have been centrally concerned. This capacity to identify with or reject our desires upon reflection and to regard those that we endorse as motivating reasons for action distinguishes agents from what Harry Frankfurt calls wantons, beings caused without reflection to behave in accordance with their strongest basic impulses. In us, influence does not necessarily mean control. Zach's oxytocin studies have not shown that people are unable, say, to deliberately override the relatively mild influences of the nasal spray. Suppose that the Voles studies turn out to translate fairly directly into humans. After all these years, I've been thinking that Kent has the virtues of being a faithful husband and devoted father. If it did turn out that given the distribution of his vasopressin receptors in the acquisition and maintenance of this behavioral trait, it's rather that he's a dopamine addict, wantonly following his base desires, that fact might lead us to reassess the moral worth of his motivations and actions. In the case of cocaine addiction, which involves these same receptors, changes in these motivations can be quite strong, even overpowering. Or if it turned out that although Kent offers morally admirable reasons for his behavior, their causal influence is not so strong that he would continue to reliably exhibit the behavior, even in the absence of the long V1-AR promoter sequence, we might be reluctant to attribute traditional virtues to Kent. I mean, we might admire him in the way that we admire a genius or an athlete or a cheerful baby, but maybe not as a moral exemplar. But I think everyday experience gives us reason to think that as strong as the emotional bonds and social attachments we form can be, this does not make our behavior inevitable or entirely outside of our control. So I grant that this interpretation could be undermined, and that there would be various ways in which a neurobiological understanding might lead us to reassess our moral evaluation. If having these behavioral phenotypes were as directly related to genotype as having blue eyes, say, it's hard to see how they could be proper objects of praise or blame. But again, the vasopressin and oxytocin studies do not show that Kent lacks control. We've long been aware, as Zach points out, that high testosterone levels increase the likelihood that one will be involved in a violent crime. So arrest rates for violent crime are consistently highest among 16 to 24-year-old males. While there's no question that testosterone influences behavior, most of us don't take this to imply that aggressive behavior is inevitable, or that we are unable to regulate our behavior through cognitive processes that are responsive to reasons or moral considerations, or that we don't have the capacity to resist these inclinations to which testosterone gives rise, or that there's no room for moral development, or that in ordinary cases we cannot sensibly be held responsible for violent crime. And as best I can see, this is also still the right thing to say about oxytocin and vasopressin. So, look, I mean, we are creatures of flesh and blood, so it should not shock us, nor would it have shocked ancients like Aristotle or Hippocrates, to recognize that character traits like courage, benevolence, generosity, or self-control are biologically mediated. We did not need contemporary neuroscience to tell us that traumatic brain injuries like that of Phineas Gage or the effects of aging can result in long-term impairments in cognitive processes like memory, attention, and executive function, or lead to significant changes in social behavior expressed by indifference or disinhibition. But the kind of information now becoming available and the level of detail at which we can study these processes will surely continue to shape moral theories in the times ahead. So, in several senses, then, virtue theorists should keep an eye on the neuroscience of character. And the next time you call some poor fellow a coward, keep in mind that the fear aversion he displays might be directly connected to an identifiable condition in his amygdala.
Great, thank you. So yeah, if you have a question, maybe we can just start people raising their hands and I'll number people off. Maybe there's not so many. One.
That was a very good talk. Thank you very much for making the link for all of us between hormones and behavior. One of the things that I know in recent research from oxytocin is that it's not so clear. So there's some research on a review by Jennifer Barnes and her colleagues finding that the effect of oxytocin depends on the person and the situation. And so there are many mixed studies showing null effects or maybe opposite. And that there are new research from DeDrew and colleagues showing that oxytocin administration is associated with increased envy, bloating, and in-group favoritism. So how does that fit with this whole model of morality?
Yeah, so I think that research should lead us to be cautious in just characterizing oxytocin as the moral molecule. I mean, I think, right, I mean, the research, exactly as you say, there's some indications that increasing oxytocin can increase kind of envy, gloating, and in-group favoritism, out-group. I think it's not quite as strong as hostility, but yeah, right. So, yeah, I mean, I think its influences are not going to be unambiguously, moral. Yay, we found kind of the moral molecule, but there's going to be a more complex range of causal influences, and I mean, I guess the point that I take from that is that we should be cautious and just kind of jumping on board and characterizing this as the moral molecule, but that, I mean, we still want a kind of careful characterization of what exactly its causal effects are. So.
Yep. Ryan, I think you're...
I'm good, thanks.
Okay.
Well, I was going to add more to the fire, so thank you so much for having a skeptical approach. And I think it's really important that the effects, the research has not shown anything like this idea that we can turn moral behavior on and off with like a garden hose with oxytocin. So I think that's really important. That stuff Sarah was saying. Second, I think what you're saying is really important too, that it's not surprising. I mean, for as long as humans have been debating, we've also known that alcohol can change your moral behavior, and that didn't suddenly stop Aristotle from thinking about virtue. So I think it shouldn't be surprising that there are biological factors that are involved in our behavior. Like you said, we're made out of flesh and blood. And then I think maybe what is surprising, however, is all of the work on neuroplasticity and on genetic plasticity, the epigenetics work. So what is really clear is that experiences make a huge difference to the density of all sorts of receptors in your brain, and the sizes of your neurons, and the densities of your of the number of synapses you have, and the masses of different parts of your brain. That simple experiences, complex experiences, all kinds of experiences makes huge differences to these biological factors. That's kind of surprising because it says, in fact, that actually what's really making a difference developmentally to moral behavior is your experiences. And the biology is more of kind of a mediator of that.
Yeah, so excellent point. And there was a section I had to cut out because it was already too long. But so just to kind of add to what you're saying, just 3 weeks ago, there was this study that came out in Nature Neuroscience where it's the first direct evidence for an epigenetic influence on this, on the oxytocin kind of receptor system in voles. And so what they found is that during mating, there's this process called histone acetylation, in which the histones are these kind of proteins that keep the DNA tightly wrapped. That sort of loosens up in this region, and so the receptors actually get transcribed, and then so you're increasing the number of receptors in the nucleus accumbens in response to behavior, in response to mating. So yeah, I do think that realizing that behavior and human action can actually have these biological effects. I think it helps us in several ways to think about the complexities involved in the causality, but then also, holds the possibility for virtue ethicists to think about how we might understand processes of habituation, say, right? If you're if your behavior is going to be resulting in potentially kind of long-term changes in your neuroanatomy, that's interesting to note, right? And that might help us to learn some stuff about moral development. And and then also things like, the way that we react to each other. If I give you a hug, that can increase oxytocin levels. There's some interesting studies that have been done where, so instead of getting oxytocin by an externally administered nasal spray, recipients get a back massage before playing a trust game, and then when kind of someone in the trust game kind of transfers a large amount of money, the people that got a back massage transfer something like 240% more funds than controls that were just sort of resting quietly instead. So I think that the behavioral, we need to keep in mind that that behavioral environmental factors can influence what's going on at the neurobiological level in ways that affect both short-term levels of these neuropeptides, and then also long-term, even changes in the receptor distribution in your brain. So very interesting. Good point.
Thomas Rickard?
This is maybe too banal to say, but just listening to Zach, who I haven't read, when he says we can turn moral behavior on and off, isn't he just blurring, using the word moral in a way that blurs important distinctions? So sometimes moral just means action that's identified behaviorally. So it's action that benefits other people, whatever its motivation. Sometimes moral behavior would be behavior maybe that benefits other people, but has an intrinsically good motive, which might be a moral thought, or it might be just an emotion like compassion. And in a third, narrower sense, moral behavior is behavior that, let's say, benefits other people and is motivated by the thought that what you're doing is right. And oxytocin can maybe turn on moral behavior in the first sense. It doesn't follow that it can turn on behavior in the second sense, and it certainly doesn't follow that it can turn on moral behavior in the third sense. So it looks to me as if he's just trading on a blurring of, what philosophers would have thought were pretty straightforward distinctions.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair point. And I think, but I think there are still some interesting issues for virtue ethicists to consider here. So, I mean, if it does turn out, I mean, well, and as the studies indicate, what we're increasing when we increase oxytocin level is, say, generous behavior that's motivationally detached from what we consider morally relevant reasons for being generous, then that that seems like a factor that's sort of causally influencing the behavior, but it's not morally significant, right? So that was what I was, okay. And then, yeah, good. And I think I had another point, but I've forgotten it now. So, yeah, good.
There might be one other sort of way of looking at this that's still nested within Aristotelian virtue theory. I'm not entirely comfortable with it, although there are a number of elements of Aristotle I'm not entirely comfortable with. But this idea, think of these examples, think of also examples of orphans who are adopted after being in terrible orphanages for several years. They're unable to attach. No amount of reflection is best I know, no amount of reflection is going to be able to move them out of that. They're scarred for life. But Aristotle grants that there are other sorts of things that he deems virtues that are simply matter of luck, physical virtues and so forth. So maybe there are several ways to work with this. Maybe one of them is to say, well, the realm of something like physical non-moral virtues is broader than we really thought. Again, I'm not endorsing this. I'm not entirely comfortable with it. I like the aspirational. I hold fast to the aspirational, but it could be that we also need to recognize that it's not simply brute physical strength or something that people are born with or have some sort of lucky imbued with in some sort of fortuitous way.
Good. Yeah, so your comment helps me remember what I also wanted to say. It's a second point to Thomas Herka's question. So, I mean, it seems so, since there's this connection between oxytocin level and feelings of empathy, when we turn to kind of naturally occurring levels of oxytocin in the brain or just natural variation in receptor distribution, those are biological influences on our motivational states, right? And so I guess traditionally virtue theory, as I understand it, has placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of kind of having the right motivations, the right reasons, and then kind of causing the behavior in the right sort of way. That's how we're going to understand virtue. And then things just get a little bit, it gets harder for me to see exactly what to say when we have these kind of just naturally occurring, so we don't tend to attribute to the cheerful baby who's got kind of maybe naturally high, I don't know what, serotonin levels or something. We kind of think that's great. It's nice that they have that, but we don't necessarily think that's a morally praiseworthy thing, right? It's just sort of how they are. And I wonder if, as we learn more about the neurobiological basis for some of these motivations, if it just gets more complicated to think about, why we're kind of why having the appropriate motivations is so important if it is going to end up in some cases being kind of a matter of luck or whatever.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question, and it's the gentleman in the back row with the jacket. I think you're next.
try to make it short. I just had three sort of short, brief points. One is, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but I think, you know, if we're thinking about virtues and we're thinking about the complexity of these kinds of character virtues, you know, these studies that focus on these biological mechanisms of vasopressin, oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, all of these things have been linked to pro-social behaviors and moral behaviors. And obviously, they are associated with these kinds of virtuous behaviors or expressions of virtue. But we know so little about how they interact with each other and exactly at what point are they really playing a role in the expression of those behaviors. Secondly, there's some findings out there, even with the oxytocin, that that dosage levels or levels of oxytocin seems to make a difference. So there's some interesting research that suggests that up to a certain point, the presence of oxytocin does result in carrying sort of, you know, loving kinds of behaviors. But at a certain point, actually, the mother prairie vole actually starts to eat their young. So that's something to keep in mind. So there may be a dosage level. Sort of,
Okay, I'm not aware of those studies, so maybe you could tell me the
this
references
is
to that.
work at the University of California, one of the schools, but I can look that up for you later. And there's also research that at certain that same oxytocin, yes, it results in caring behaviors, but it also results in aggression towards outsiders, more aggressive behaviors. So it's not a very simple kind of thing, and you know, we get into these. And the last thing I want to mention is that the work on testosterone, which you mentioned at the very end, is also not quite very consistent in terms of whether it has a direct effects on aggression. If anything, it has indirect effects, and it has effects, it does produce more aggressive behaviors, but only under certain circumstances. So it's just, I think some of these biological explanations, you know, it really just gets blurry very quickly, and people, it's still in its infancy, and we know so little about how these mechanisms are really working to affect behaviors that we see in people.
Good. Yeah. So maybe that point about the complexity is sort of a good note to end on, and you know, I guess just going forward, my main kind of message is that some of it could turn out to be relevant for issues that ethicists care about.